The entire session will be recorded very well by the ISCO UK website. You can also leave your feedback in the Meetup comments section on the website, and let us know if you would like to present a talk in the ISCO UK meetups. This is for anybody, students, researchers, experts, anyone in the knowledge organization area. On behalf of the meetup team, we have the pleasure of introducing Chris Newell, Lead Technologist at the BBC Research and Development, who will share his expert knowledge on semantic tagging and text classification. To you, Chris.
Oh, thanks, Harith. I'll just share my screen. Is that presenting okay?
Yes.
That's good, thank you.
Fine.
Cheers.
I'm Chris Newell. I work for BBC Research and Development. I'll just give you a quick introduction to the department. The BBC's charter actually requires us to do research and development, not just for the BBC, but for the whole UK media industry. We've got about 200 staff working in 2 research labs, one in London and one up in Salford. And we work on every aspect of broadcast and online services. So that's from the content production through to the distribution, and then the consumption by audiences and any interaction with the audiences. We've got a small team who works on natural language processing. So as well as semantic tagging and text classification, we do a lot of work on speech to text and things like text summarization and sentiment analysis. And we apply these techniques to the large volume of text that the BBC deals with in its day-to-day activities. So all the web pages, a lot of news feeds, but also the subtitles and transcripts associated with all our programming, which is a vast amount of text data. Then we also look at social media, either the BBC's internal forums, public forums, and external social media sites. So today I'm going to focus on semantic tagging and text classification. And in summary, this is describing a document in terms of unambiguous entities and themes, and using those to link to additional sources of information. And the tagging can either be all the entities and themes mentioned in the text, and we call this mentions tagging, or it can be the primary topics of the text, so just 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 topics, and we call this about tagging inside the BBC. The motivation for this work goes back 10 years to a project called the World Service Archive Project. And this project basically took and digitized a large number of programs, 70,000 from over 60 years of broadcasting on the World Service. And unfortunately, the metadata associated with that content was very sparse, quite often inaccurate or even non-existent. Quite often there was just a box with the tape in it, with a handwritten note stuck to it. It was really very difficult to see what we had there, but obviously there was going to be some real gems. And so what we needed was a way to find out what was in there and be able to search and navigate and so forth. An efficient use of this is impossible unless you have good metadata, so that's what we needed. So the approach we adopted was to run all that content, and I think it was something like 3 years of continuous audio, through speech-to-text technology to create transcripts for all the programs. And then we developed an automated tagging system called Mango to extract tags from that text. And then we use those tags to support search and navigation in the prototype, which you can see on the right. And whilst that prototype was publicly available, we actually allowed people to give feedback on the tags so they could correct errors or correct omissions. And we found there were quite a few people who were keen to do this, took it quite seriously, and obviously some domain experts out there who are keen to tag programs they were interested in. Now, Mango, the system we developed for this, is basically a semantic tagging system, and it identifies mentions, anything which is mentioned in the text. So for the text you can see here, we really want to identify these key entities. And to identify them, we use something called DBpedia identifiers. DBpedia is a database which is basically derived from Wikipedia, and you can probably recognize from the last part of these locators that these identifiers map not only to DBpedia, but they are related to Wikipedia pages. And so you can use these identifiers to access additional information in the DBpedia, a whole array of information, a whole web, if you like, which shows the benefits of linked data and this sort of approach. Mango has two components. There is a spotter and a disambiguator, and both are created using a complete dump of Wikipedia, which is available every month. They do a public dump. And the spotter basically has an index which matches surface forms found in the text to entities. So for example, down here, you can see 4 surface forms which are related or could be related to Birmingham City Football Club. And they all map to this identifier down here at the bottom. But there's a problem. Of course, many of the surface forms are ambiguous. So Birmingham could refer to Birmingham City Football Club, but it could also refer to the city in the UK or the one in America or various other things. So we need a way to disambiguate those entities. So this is the schematic diagram for Mango, and you can see the spotter on the left, which is using the index derived from DBpedia. And it presents a set of candidate URIs for each surface form to the disambiguator. And the disambiguator uses something called word2vec. And if you've not come across this before, word2vec is a vector space representation of words. Now I'm showing it here in 2 dimensions, but it's typically 200 dimensions. And the key point here is that words which are related to each other and entities which are related to each other in this vector space will be close together. They will have similar vectors, whereas words which are unrelated will be a long distance apart. And you can do lots of interesting things with it. And the one thing we used it for was this disambiguation. So what we did was, you can create a vector to represent the document, basically by concatenating all the vectors for the individual words that you find in the document. And you can then compare that against the vectors for each of the candidate entities. So here I'm comparing the document with the entity representing Birmingham City Football Club. And the angle between those vectors gives you a strong indication of how closely they are related. The smaller the angle, the more similar that entity or more relevant it is to that document. And so basically we would put all the candidate entities through this and select the one with the highest similarity score. And this is a picture of Mango in action. So there's some text at the top, and you can see in the column on the left, the surface forms that it's identified using the spotter, and then the topic, which has been mapped to that surface form. And there's a score, which is basically obtained from that word2vec model, which gives you some indication of how relevant those entities are to the document. So Mango worked really well, surprisingly well, and was really useful in making the World Service archive accessible. And it supported this prototype you can see on the left, which was run for a while. And it meant that the information which was completely inaccessible before could be easily browsed. And it means that people inside the BBC can search it and can find content. And there's actually now on the BBC website, you can look at clips and programs which have been found in the World Service Archive and relevant to contemporary issues. Now that's that project. And moving on to a second one, second topic, which is tag suggestion for news and sport. Now in the BBC journalists manually tag every published article when it's put through the content production system. And these tags are quite important because they might affect where a story might appear on the website, but they're used for various purposes, and they're very significant to how news manages its content. So it's really important the journalists do a consistent and thorough job of tagging each article. And they've been doing this now for about 7 years. But to help them, we've introduced automatic tag suggestion. And if you look on the right, this is a part of the content production system. They can either search for a tag in the category box at the top, but also there are these suggestions down below, which make it easier to find things. It's particularly useful if you've got staff who aren't very familiar with tagging, new staff, new journalists, and they're not familiar with how the BBC tags things and what topics and tags are available, because the suggestions will give them a good guide of how an article might be tagged. Now, we tried using Mango in this for a couple of years, I think it was, and it worked reasonably well, but there was a problem, and that was that there are typically 20 to 30 mentions tags for a typical news article. That's far too many to put forward as suggestions, and it was very hard to identify which ones were the most relevant. So we developed a new text tagging system specifically for tagged suggestion in news and sport called Starfruit. Starfruit is different because it uses a dictionary of terms called BBC Things, which is something we develop and maintain internally. And it's basically a dictionary of entities, themes, and storylines which are relevant to the BBC. I think there's approaching 100,000 entries now. And for example, if there's a breaking story like the Grenfell Tower disaster, a journalist will create a tag to represent that story, and it will be used by all the journalists to tag related stories. Starfruit uses very standard multi-label text classifiers. It's trained using about 5 years of articles which have been manually tagged by BBC journalists. And it uses a statistical approach using two technologies, TF-IDF and support vector machines. And I can't really go into the detail of those today, so I put some links in there if you're interested. And it actually supports 11,000 unique tags. And because news is quite dynamic, we train it every 48 hours to incorporate any news tags and new storylines which are appearing. And this is showing Starfruit in action. I've got a story on the left, and these are the topics tags, the about tags for this story. And so typically, it will find 3 to 5 topics for a typical news article. But it will also do mentions tagging. So this is basically all the entities found in the text, typically 10 to 30 entities in a news article. And Starfruit has been really effective for tag suggestion in the content production system, much better than the previous Mango system. And it's also found applications elsewhere in the BBC. So we're not only tagging news articles, but we also use it to tag iPlayer content. So things like the program descriptions and even the subtitles from TV programs can be tagged using Starfruit. And then we also use it in another BBC news system called Wolf Tech, which is a news planning system. What this is used for is to plan all the resources around developing news stories and coordinate them. And this is a typical Wolf text story. So this is a story before publication, when it's in the planning stage. So this basically manages all the resources which are directed towards the story, captures all the information which is being accumulated and so forth. And the key point here is that the journalists basically do not want to do manual tagging at this stage in the story. They're far too busy developing the story. But also another point is that because any tagging we do here is internal, it doesn't need the same careful editorial control that we need when we actually publish content. So it's an ideal application for automated tagging. We can tolerate a certain number of errors, basically. Down in the box on the bottom right, you can see the tags which have been extracted from this particular story. And they have a number of potential uses which are still being developed. One of these is that it's very difficult to get a good idea, a global view of all the activities in the newsroom and all the stories which are being developed in this Wolf text system. So what you can do with the tags is a statistical analysis, and you can break down the stories and show how much of the newsroom resources are being dedicated to particular stories. And journalists can also see if other staff are working on closely related stories or overlapping stories, and therefore it sort of facilitates collaboration as well. So the tags have a number of potential users which we're still developing, but it's a really exciting development to use automated tagging in this dynamic system. That's all I wanted to show you today, but I thought I'd put up a list of alternative tagging systems that are out there for people who haven't got the resources to develop their own. There's a system called DBpedia Spotlight, which is very similar to Mango. It's a mentions tagger, and it's also related to DBpedia and trained using Wikipedia content. So it's very similar to the Mango approach. And the good thing about it is it's open source, and there are models available for many different languages. So it's really quite a useful piece of software. There's also a system called Tagmatic, which is a commercial system developed by a British company, which is very similar to Starfruit. If you do a lot of manual tagging in your business, and you can provide that to Tagmatic, it can be used to train their system and adapt it to your content and your application. So it's very, very similar to the way Starfruit works. And then finally, all the big cloud companies have NLP services, which include tagging for text. So Amazon Comprehend, Google Natural Language, and so forth. I've only had a quick look at all these systems here, so I can't make any recommendations, and I've probably missed out a lot of competing products. So this is the usual disclaimer, but basically they all do a reasonable job as far as I can see of tagging text. So they're really useful. So thank you for listening. That's all I wanted to say. So I guess that leaves time for questions if anybody has any.
If people could put their questions into the chat, that would be great. I've had a couple just asking if the URIs or URLs rather of the resources would be, if we can share those. I think the presentation will be added to the ISCO website after this meetup. So you can download the presentation with the URLs within that. But that was a really interesting talk. So thanks, Chris. I'm always fascinated by how the BBC manages to tag such a vast library and collection of documents and audio content really to make it available. It just seems to be a never-ending task that I've. This is possibly about the fourth or fifth talk I've heard from the BBC, and I think it just impresses me every time that it feels like it's a monumental task, but you're doing so well at it.
Well, thank you for that. I just realized there's one thing I didn't say, is that you might get an impression from this that I'm really keen on automated tagging, but actually I sort of believe that you should only use automated tagging when it's the last option. It's editorial, manual tagging by people who are experts in the content is always the preferred option. You can see here there are situations where that really isn't practical. With the World Service Archive, people were never going to go back and tag those 70 years of programming. So we needed to use automated tagging. And likewise, where we use Starfruit, it's usually for tag suggestion, and there is editorial control, and it's not intended to replace humans. They're the experts.
Thanks for adding that, because I mean that was a question I was going to bring up anyway myself, but we've got a few in the chat, and I might be talking about that later. Claudia would like to know, is Mango available only for English documents, or English documents, I'm assuming?
It supports 10 or 11 languages, I think, apart from English. It can support any language which has an edition of Wikipedia, in theory. And we've tried it on about, I think, 11 other languages now.
Okay. Paul has asked a very relevant question. Do you check for any bias in your story labeling?
It's obviously going to reflect any bias in the tagging that BBC journalists do day to day in their operations. And the only thing I can say there is that that process is very carefully controlled and monitored. And we've tried to get very high quality tagging by making sure people are consistent in the number of tags and the tags they use for specific subjects. And I imagine that editorial team, which is controlling that tagging, would also be looking out for any of that kind of bias. But for Starfruit itself, I have not done any particular specific checks on it.
Thank you. Guy says, how did you disambiguate in Starfruit? I've got Star Trek on the mind here. Starfruit.
Well, the support vector machines that it uses give you a score for each tag. So you can use that score in various ways to measure relevance, but also if you have multiple matches for a particular surface form, you can use them to disambiguation. So yeah, we're basically using the classification score.
Okay, and a similar question from Juan. Hyun, sorry, I do apologise. I know I'm not pronouncing your name correctly. Could you please tell us what the disambiguation in Mango entails? I assume it could disambiguate entities and subject terms.
Yes, take, for example, we were looking at surface form Birmingham. If it spots the word Birmingham in a document, it will look it up in its index, and it could find maybe 7 or so potential entities and subjects which match that surface form. So we need to disambiguate those. And what we do is, as I showed with the word to vec model, is look at how close the vectors are in that word to vec space for those entities compared to the document vector. And that's the vector created from the document itself by concatenating the vectors for each word that you find in the document. So that's a standard way of creating a document vector in word to vec. There's a little bit of maths around that. I'm quite happy to share that if you're interested.
I'm sure we will be. Eugene has asked, do you have any insights into how tags are monitored and cleaned up is there any automation that you use there?
I'm not quite sure which.
I can probably clarify what I meant by the question. So one of the applications that you showed was support for journalists doing tagging, so the tag suggestions. And I was just wondering if people can add their own tags, then what's the sort of governance process around, around these tags, and what can and cannot be added, and how are these cleaned up? If that makes sense.
Yes. Well, there actually is a process in place which manages those tags, and they are closely monitored. It has been a managed process, because you're right, if you just leave it to people to add tags as they see fit, you can quickly get a tag space which no longer makes much sense and is ambiguous and it has a lot of redundancy. So the way tags are produced is a monitored process. Yeah.
Are you automating that in any way?
It's not automated, no. I think it's manually monitored.
Thank you.
Guy has asked that you mentioned BBC Things is a set of concepts. Are they?
Yes.
They are NA graph. So do you use that graph tool in your NLP systems?
They are, I believe, a graph. It's publicly available.
It's spelling. They are in a graph. So do you use that graph, right?
I can't think of any particular application that I use of that, but I'm sure they are used that way. They have various relationships, and there's an ontology around them, which defines how they're related, and different predicates as well, in the way they can be used.
And so when did your ontology get developed? Was that a separate project?
I think it is, yes. There is a BBC Things website, if you do a search, which has a link to the ontology, which was developed. There's a whole set of BBC ontologies, in fact.
No, I didn't know that.
Oh. This is a programs ontology and various other things related to sport and so forth. Yeah.
Great. And there's a couple of links have been added into the chat, so thanks for that as well. Leonard is asking, do you build any structured relationships between tags, such as broad narrow terms, so that people can search at different levels of specificity? Is it a taxonomy or thesaurus structure?
There are broad and narrow concepts and related concepts, and yeah, there's a number of relationships.
And this is open to all your journalists to use it? Are they selecting the terms from it, or are they? How does that work? Sorry, quizzing you about this.
I'm not actually sure how they're used by the journalists, but there are various functions based on those.
Okay, I was just wondering, because you just quickly going back to, you were talking about manual tagging, and all the journalists tag all their content, yeah?
Yep.
So I was just wondering, and obviously that is a kind of, would need to be done in some kind of controlled manner, as you mentioned earlier. So I was just wondering if they use these structured lists or structured taxonomies.
I can't remember offhand, but there are some relationships which they can use, I think,
okay, super.
which are in there, such as the what's the alternatives. There's a list of alternatives.
Okay. Liz Wilson is asking, who built your ontologies?
Oh, I'm not the expert on that. I'm afraid I'd have to go back, but there's quite a lot of work on linked data, which stemmed from the Olympics back possibly 2008. And there was a team who developed it for that. And in fact, a lot of the structure of the website around that Olympics was controlled by the tags and the ontologies and the tagging that they did and the BBC things they created. Basically, I think every athlete had a tag and so forth. That made it much easier for you to find out all the results related to a particular athlete and so forth. And from that work based around the Olympics, the work expanded. Now, you ought to get somebody who's an expert on linked data in the BBC to come and give this talk, because I'm probably not going to do it justice.
We will see what we can do.
Well,
Yeah.
we're very fortunate. Paul, do you want to chip in?
Sure, I can. I mean, I've obviously left the BBC five years ago or so I don't know what the current practice is. But yeah, I believe that ontologies started to be used around 2008, 2009 with the programs ontology and the music ontology. And yeah, the programs was the first one really to use it. But as others have said, the Olympics in 2012 was really the catalyst there. And in my experience, the data architects developed the ontologies together with domain experts, editorial folk. And yeah, they also help create the tags themselves.
Thank you. I've got another question about the broader and narrow concepts. Do you try to suggest tags at the most narrow place in the hierarchy? So I guess if what you're saying is if it gets quite granular, is there a tag suggestion?
The tag suggestion, because it's so closely tied to the training data, it reflects what journalists tend to use for the text. So one of the reasons it works really well is the quality of the training data, because the journalists have been doing this very effectively for so long now. It's about 400,000 training documents. And so it basically reflects what journalists typically use for those sorts of articles. So we don't usually need to provide any navigation up and down between coarser or finer grained tagging. That might be better as part of the search interface, I think, rather than the tag suggestion.
Right. There's quite a few questions coming in. I hope, yes, this is okay. Paul Matthews asks, what would you suggest could be the best approach to bootstrapping a custom things list for a domain where you don't have existing tags?
Well, you could do something based on Wikipedia and DBpedia. The problem there is the huge size of it. You've got tags in there for just about everything you can imagine, and that might be unmanageable. What you want is a really focused list. I'd probably start with something like TF-IDF and analyze the most significant terms. If people haven't come across TF-IDF, it basically just finds the most relevant keywords in a corpus of documents. So do a TF-IDF analysis and see what's coming up in your corpus.
Thanks. Conversation about the Olympics, and yeah. We appear to have come to the end of the comments and questions. So has anybody? If there's also a message, if you'd like to ask a question in person, to let us know. But if are there any more questions from our audience? Oh, there's one. Tata has asked, why do you still see value in auto-tagging materials using NLP techniques while similar technologies are used in the intelligence searches rather? Is it mainly about making it's easier for users to access similar content without the need for a search query. Would you mind expanding on this topic a little more, please?
Yeah, well, I guess not everything is a search. That's the thing. You need to provide a structure for navigation sometimes. So, if you want to provide a menu and a list of different topics, that's a bit different to a search, and you need to have done some sort of keyword extraction to provide those sorts of menus of items, if you like. And that was the case with the World Service Archive. It wasn't just a case of saying search for an item. It was also providing an overview of the topics and how much material there were on particular topics in the archive. Does that make sense?
It makes sense to me. Hopefully it makes sense to Tata. Phil, I think, has added to the chat, and if tool for automated subject indexing. So there's another link there for people. Are there any more questions? Just give it another moment. Are there any questions from the panelists?
Well, people are welcome to get in touch after the event if they've got anything else they'd like to ask. And of course, there'll be the presentation.
Yes, indeed. It has been recorded, so it will be on the ISCO UK website shortly. That looks as though it is it for the time being. So thanks very much, Chris. It's been really interesting, really informative.
Thank you so much, Chris. It was amazing, the insight into the BBC text classification. With thanks to Nikki, Eugene and Phil for helping to organize these meetups. Our next meetup is on July the 6th at the same time, 6:30 p.m. GMT. We have Professor Stephen Robertson to discuss some of the themes explored in his new book, BC or Before Computers, on information technology from writing to the age of digital data. I really recommend it, and I really would like you all to join us. And more information will be published soon on the meetup site. Thank you very much to Chris, and everybody have a great evening. Thank you, Chris.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Chris. Very enjoyable.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you. Bye.